never imagined myself in this place, standing among men whose silence spoke louder than their words. My name is Mark, and today was my first day at the base, a raw introduction to the stark reality awaiting me at the front line. I haven't experienced battle yet, haven't tasted the true fear or desperation, but the atmosphere here already told me more than any training could. The camp felt bleak, set against a cold, gray sky that drained color from everything beneath it. The wind was harsh, whipping relentlessly through our thin canvas tents and making our bones ache with cold. The faces of the soldiers I saw were equally weathered, their eyes hollow, bodies visibly thinner from hardship. Captain Harris, my commanding officer, introduced himself personally. He wasn't imposing physically, but his presence commanded immediate respect. There was a quiet strength about him, tempered by something deeply personal, a shadow of sadness lurking behind his steady gaze. I later learned why, sitting among some of the veterans near a small, flickering fire. "He lost his closest friend last month," said Ellis, a soldier whose weary face bore a long scar across his jaw. "They'd served together since the beginning. Losing someone you've shared everything with, that changes a man." Ellis handed me a cup filled with bitter coffee, warm but offering little comfort. Around us, other soldiers nodded solemnly, each absorbed in their thoughts. Ramirez, another seasoned soldier with deep-set, tired eyes, leaned forward. "Mark, you need to know the truth. This place isn't like the stories you've heard. Out here, there are days without food, nights where sleep is impossible, times when thirst and hunger become your closest companions." His words sank heavily into my mind. I glanced around at the men gathered here. Their uniforms were worn, hanging loosely from frames that had endured more than I could imagine. Ramirez continued softly. "We survived 3 days without rations once. Ate roots, insects, whatever we could scavenge. Hunger isn't just an emptiness. It's a constant pain that eats away at your soul." Captain Harris appeared quietly behind us, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He clearly overheard the conversation, his voice steady yet gentle. "They're right, Mark. Things get brutal here. You'll question everything you've ever believed. But you're not alone. None of us are. Remember that. Remember." His words resonated deeply, comforting yet somehow foreboding. The captain squeezed my shoulder gently before walking away, his silhouette dissolving into the dim light of the camp. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in my tent, the reality of what awaited me pressing heavily upon my chest. I thought of the captain, carrying his grief silently, maintaining strength for the rest of us. I thought of the soldiers I just met, men whose survival had been hard-earned through pain and sacrifice. Tomorrow, our training would intensify. Tomorrow, I'd begin preparing myself physically and mentally for the brutal conditions ahead. But tonight, alone with my thoughts, I made a silent promise. I would survive. Not just for myself, but for the men beside me, men like Ellis, Ramirez, and Captain Harris. My journey was just beginning, and I knew one thing clearly. The worst was yet to come. Morning broke with a pale, watery sunlight filtering weakly through the gaps in my tent. My body felt stiff, my muscles already aching from the cold night spent tossing restlessly. Outside, the camp was stirring with muted activity. Soldiers moved quietly, efficiently, each absorbed in tasks that had long become second nature. After quickly dressing, I stepped outside into air heavy with moisture and tension. The landscape around us was barren and unforgiving, dotted by patches of sparse vegetation and scarred by the tracks of heavy vehicles. This was our training ground, a cruel reflection of what awaited us further ahead. Captain Harris was already assembling a small group of soldiers, gesturing firmly as he assigned duties. His voice carried authority without raising a tone. Seeing me approach, he nodded curtly, indicating I should join them. "Today we'll simulate frontline conditions," Captain Harris began, scanning our faces one by one. "Your survival and the survival of your fellow soldiers depend on quick thinking, adaptability, and endurance. Supplies may be limited or entirely unavailable. You must prepare mentally and physically." I felt a tightness grip my chest as he continued to outline the day's exercises. We would practice navigating hostile terrain, securing shelter, improvising food and water sources, and handling casualties, all under simulated enemy fire. Despite the controlled conditions, Harris warned us it would feel very real. Ellis stood beside me, offering an encouraging but solemn glance. "Stay close," he whispered. "Watch and learn." We set out shortly after, marching towards an area prepared to mimic abandoned trenches and ruined bunkers. The ground was uneven, filled with mud, loose rocks, and hidden obstacles designed to test our vigilance. Every step was treacherous, every breath a reminder of the hardship ahead. Halfway through the march, Captain Harris halted us abruptly. "Enemy ambush," he announced sharply. "Take cover, secure the wounded, and set up a perimeter. Now." Adrenaline surged through my veins as soldiers scattered, instinctively falling into practiced roles. Shouts filled the air, orders overlapping in urgency. My heart raced as I scrambled to follow Ellis, ducking low behind makeshift barriers of logs and rocks. "Keep your head down," Ellis cautioned sharply, pulling me lower as simulated gunfire erupted around us. Smoke grenades burst, obscuring visibility and adding to the realism. Nearby, soldiers dragged mannequins representing wounded comrades to safer locations, mimicking the chaos of a real battlefield. My pulse hammered relentlessly as I tried to remember my training, adrenaline threatening to cloud my thoughts. Yet amidst the confusion, Captain Harris's voice cut clearly through the noise, directing us calmly and decisively. "Mark! Ellis, you're isolated from the group," he shouted, urgency clear in his tone. "Secure shelter, find supplies, stay alive. We'll regroup later." The order was chilling in its simplicity. Ellis grabbed my arm firmly. "Come on," he said, voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to move now." We ran through the smoke and noise, ducking low, relying solely on instinct and quick thinking. My breathing was ragged, fear biting at my heels. Yet somehow, beneath the terror, a strange clarity began forming. This wasn't just practice. It was preparation for survival. By the time we reached a sheltered trench, my lungs burned and my body trembled with exertion. Ellis quickly scanned our surroundings, nodding approval. "Good," he murmured, catching his breath. "You handled yourself well." I nodded silently, still unable to fully process the intensity of the moment. But one thing was clear. Today was only the beginning, a small taste of what awaited us at the front line. And for the first time, I felt truly ready to face it. The trench Ellis and I had taken refuge in felt uncomfortably real, its walls cold and damp against our backs. Our breathing gradually slowed, matching the rhythm of the silence that enveloped us. Ellis carefully checked his gear, his movements precise despite his obvious exhaustion. "Now we find supplies," Ellis said quietly, glancing at me with determination. "Anything that can keep us alive. Food, water, ammunition, prioritize in that order." I nodded, trying to mask the tremor in my hands as I checked my own gear. Every sound around us seemed amplified. The distant crackle of simulated gunfire, muffled shouts, the wind whispering ominously through the trench. Even though this was training, my nerves reacted as though it was the real thing. We cautiously moved through the winding trenches, eyes scanning for hidden caches and anything useful left behind. Ellis moved with a practiced grace, his experience evident in each deliberate step. His calm presence steadied my nerves, gradually easing the tightness in my chest. After several tense minutes, Ellis stopped abruptly, signaling me to stay still. Ahead, partially concealed by mud and debris, lay a crate. Its wooden frame splintered, indicating it had seen rough treatment, but it looked promising. Ellis approached cautiously, carefully lifting the lid to inspect its contents. He exhaled with relief, pulling out a couple of ration packs and a battered water flask, passing one of each to me. "This could keep us alive for another day or two," he murmured, a faint smile flickering across his weary face. As we quickly consumed the food, stale crackers and dried meat, I felt the hunger I hadn't even noticed begin to subside slightly. Ellis drank sparingly from the flask, his eyes never losing their vigilance. I followed suit, understanding that discipline would be crucial in the days ahead. "We can't stay here," Ellis said softly, finishing his portion and carefully storing the rest. "They'll expect us to regroup soon. Let's move." As we navigated our way back through the maze-like trenches toward our rendezvous point, my mind raced with thoughts about everything I'd experienced today. The exercise was intended to simulate reality, yet it had felt undeniably authentic. The fear, the tension, the uncertainty, all felt tangible, etched into my memory. When we finally rejoined our unit, Captain Harris was already waiting, his face unreadable. He gave a brief nod of approval as we approached. "Well done," he said, voice steady and reassuring. "You adapted quickly. That adaptability could be the difference between life and death." His words lingered in my mind as we returned to the camp, exhaustion pressing heavily upon my shoulders. Night was descending again, and with it, a renewed understanding of what awaited me on the front. Captain Harris caught my eye as we parted ways, his gaze filled with unspoken reassurance and quiet strength. Alone again in my tent, I lay awake, replaying the day's events. Fear still gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, but it was tempered now by a new confidence, a belief forged in hardship, even simulated, that I could endure. Sleep came slowly, but eventually it claimed me, offering temporary escape before another grueling day would arrive. The morning came too soon, breaking through the lingering fog of sleep with unforgiving brightness. I woke slowly, my body protesting every movement. Despite yesterday's exhausting drills, a newfound clarity settled in my mind, bringing a strange sense of calm. I knew the road ahead was long, but at least now I understood the stakes. As I stepped out of the tent, the camp appeared unusually quiet. Soldiers moved silently, carrying out their routines with a subdued seriousness that hinted at something significant ahead. Captain Harris stood at the center, gathering everyone with a quiet, yet unmistakable urgency. "Today is about final preparations," he announced as soon as we assembled. His gaze met each of ours, carrying a weight of responsibility and quiet determination. "You'll soon be deployed directly to the front line. Each of you must understand exactly what awaits. Your training has only been a glimpse. Reality will test you beyond anything you've imagined." His words hung heavy in the air, echoing in my mind as soldiers around me shifted uneasily. Captain Harris continued, his tone softening slightly. "Remember, your priority is survival, yours and your comrades. Rely on one another, support each other, and above all, never lose hope." We spent the rest of the day meticulously packing supplies, checking weapons, and reviewing survival protocols. Every ration, every bullet, every piece of gear felt suddenly precious. Ellis stayed close, quietly explaining small details overlooked in training: how to conserve water, recognize edible plants, and maintain focus under extreme conditions. Late in the afternoon, Captain Harris approached me privately, his expression serious yet compassionate. "Mark, you'll be on the front line in less than 24 hours. Trust yourself, trust your training, and trust your instincts. You're ready for this." I met his gaze, recognizing the sincerity in his words and the quiet courage behind his eyes. "Thank you, sir," I responded softly, knowing the words fell short of the gratitude I felt. That evening, as darkness enveloped the camp once more, we gathered around a small fire, sharing stories, quiet laughter, and reflections that offered fleeting comfort. I listened intently, absorbing each moment, understanding that soon these moments would become precious memories. Eventually, silence settled over the group. Captain Harris spoke quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Tomorrow changes everything. Be strong, stay vigilant, and never forget why we're here: to protect each other." As the fire dwindled to embers, we dispersed, each soldier retreating quietly into their thoughts. Returning to my tent, I carefully laid out my gear, feeling both anxious and determined. Tonight was my last night of relative safety, my final quiet moment before stepping into chaos. Lying awake, I stared into the darkness, mentally rehearsing scenarios, reassuring myself of my readiness. Fear still lingered, but alongside it, courage was taking root. My heart beat steadily, accepting the uncertain path ahead. Tomorrow, my real journey would begin. Tomorrow, I would step into the front line's ruthless embrace. But tonight, I embraced a quiet resolve. I would survive, adapt, and overcome no matter the cost. My name is Mark, and tomorrow I face the unknown.